This piece of environmental vandalism only increased the pressure on Schwarzkopf to launch the ground campaign. His plan was a masterpiece of strategic deception. The main attack would appear to come down here, across Kuwait's southern border. 40,000 American Marines would thrust up into the Iraqi defenses. Alongside them, troops from other coalition countries, including large forces from Syria and Egypt. Their job was to make Saddam think they were just the start of a much larger attack from here in the south. But Schwarzkopf's main blow would come not from the south, but from the west. Under the cover of the air war, he had secretly shifted the bulk of his army, 1,500 tanks and nearly 300,000 men, up to 300 miles off to the west to launch a giant left hook. His main heavy tank force, with Britain's men and tanks on their right flank, were waiting for the signal to burst into Iraq and swing east into Saddam's Republican Guard divisions, dug in on the Kuwait-Iraq border. Schwarzkopf's men had a double mission: to liberate Kuwait and to so weaken the Republican Guard and the Iraqi army that they could never cause trouble in the area again. On the 24th of February, 1991, the ground attack began.
Out in the Gulf, the big guns of the US warships began a massive artillery barrage onto the Kuwaiti coastline. But the real attack would come from the ground troops. And the first to go in would be the US Marines.
This is it. Have fun.
We've got an American flag in this pack right here we're going to raise in Kuwait.
The Marines had to bulldoze gaps in huge banks of sand like this one so the tanks and artillery could advance. In front of them, they expected vast minefields and tens of thousands of Iraqi troops in heavily defended, entrenched positions. Coalition commanders expected the Marines to be able to penetrate just a few miles into the heavy Iraqi defenses, with as many as 1 in 3 of the Marines being killed or injured. But as the Marines crossed into Kuwait, they were amazed at what happened. Everywhere, Iraqi troops had either abandoned their positions or were raising the white flag in surrender. Most of them were conscripts, and after the devastating 5-week air bombardment, they were sleep-deprived, shell-shocked, and dehydrated. They were in no position to fight.
Okay. All right. Hey, let's go. Get up here.
The Marines continued forward into Kuwait. There was little resistance, and nearly everywhere their progress was unopposed.
The Marines were scoring a major success in their thrust up here into Kuwait, almost too successful. They and the Arab forces to the east and west of them were fast heading for Kuwait City. There was now a risk that some of the crack Iraqi units, like the Republican Guard up here, might retreat before Schwarzkopf's army could destroy them. So he brought forward the timetable for his main attack. He ordered his big left hook, including Britain's tank force, to go in 15 hours ahead of schedule. The British would go for Kuwait, and the US tanks would head for the Republican Guard.
10 hours into the ground war, at 2:30 p.m., British and American troops began a massive artillery barrage onto the Iraqi positions in front of them. One of their key weapons was the multiple launch rocket system. As each of the rockets burst in the air above the Iraqis, it scattered 644 bomblets over them. It was as if they were being showered by hand grenades. In just over 30 minutes, more than 500,000 of these bomblets landed on the Iraqi troops. As the artillery died down, more than 150,000 coalition troops and over 1,500 tanks began their advance.
Saddam knew he couldn't keep Kuwait much longer, but he was still determined to show the Americans he had the capacity to hit them where it hurt. He ordered his troops inside Kuwait to counterattack against the US Marines. But they couldn't match the Americans' firepower, nor halt their relentless drive towards Kuwait City. However, Saddam still had one last sting in his tail. Iraqi troops fired a Scud missile towards a coalition base in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. The resulting explosion killed 28 Americans, and 100 were left wounded.
Has to go up there.
It was their biggest single loss in the war so far. Despite this incident, the British and American troops had to keep up the speed of their advance. Saddam's army was collapsing by the minute, and every minute counted if Schwarzkopf was to be able to destroy the bulk of Iraq's military equipment before it escaped. Schwarzkopf's main armored thrust had swept across 100 miles of Iraqi desert west of Kuwait and closed in on Saddam's elite Republican Guard. Finally, at 4 p.m. on the 26th of February, they came face to face.
The gunner in the lead American tank quickly fired off a shot at one of the Iraqi tanks. Within seconds, the other American tanks had opened fire. In just a few minutes, the Republican Guard's position had been obliterated. The Iraqi tanks had been utterly outgunned. The American tanks could score a hit on the move from over 2,000 meters away. Iraqi tanks were only accurate below 1,700 meters, and they had to be stationary. Within a couple of hours, over 50 Iraqi armored vehicles were destroyed, with few American losses. Throughout the night, the Americans pursued the Republican Guard. By daybreak, they'd smashed an entire division, leaving over 100 tanks and armored vehicles smoking on the battlefield. The remaining Republican Guard divisions made a desperate retreat, and the Americans continued to hunt them down. Iraqi troops had been fleeing from Kuwait City in any vehicle they could get their hands on. American commanders were determined to stop them. It led to one of the most controversial episodes of the war. Using laser-guided bombs, pilots attacked Iraqi vehicles along a stretch of this road leading north from Kuwait City. This created a roadblock, and behind it, hundreds of vehicles became trapped in a giant traffic jam. This made them totally vulnerable to the American aircraft overhead. Some of them were so desperate to escape that they drove off across the desert. Every available American aircraft was ordered into the attack, with devastating results. For mile after mile, charred vehicles and human corpses littered the desert and choked the two main roads going towards Iraq. An estimated 2,000 vehicles were destroyed. Only very few of them were tanks or armored personnel carriers. Most were civilian vehicles stolen by the Iraqi army as they fled Kuwait City. Nobody knows how many hundreds or thousands of Iraqis died in the attacks. The American leadership realized that pictures like these would soon be on television around the world, and they feared it would look like a massacre. This would become a key factor in deciding when to end the war. "36 hours later, coalition troops led by units from Kuwait's own army arrived in Kuwait City. The streets soon filled with vehicles as people celebrated the end of the Iraqi occupation.
Welcome in Kuwait. Welcome, Mr. Bush. Welcome.
With the liberation of Kuwait, the main political goal of the war had been achieved. But the Republican Guard had not yet been destroyed. However, President Bush feared that continuing to bomb a retreating enemy might give the impression that America was behaving like a bully. And so, on February the 28th, 1991, Bush declared a ceasefire.
I am pleased to announce that exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
The Gulf War was over. Within weeks, tens of thousands of coalition troops began the long journey home. All of them grateful that the mass casualties they'd feared had never materialized.
In total, 248 coalition troops were killed, far less than anyone had dared hope. Nobody knows how many Iraqis died, though some estimates put the figure at over 30,000.
The Allies could have chased Saddam all the way to Baghdad, but they had no authority from the UN and no wish to become mired in Iraq.
But Saddam's regime did not crumble as the Americans hoped. He crushed two uprisings that followed the end of the war and remained in power for another 12 years. Schwarzkopf and his men returned home to a hero's welcome.